All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Well, hello and welcome to the Actual Anarchy podcast, the podcast where we talk about movies from a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist perspective. Tonight, we are going to... Oh, man. This is going to be a tough one. Per the Big Lebowski, nobody fucks with the Jesus. Well, that's what we're doing tonight a little bit. We're going to do the Passion of the Christ for the 125th episode of the show. We're going to be talking about this with the AnarchoChristian, and he will be on in a moment. Robert, I have a feeling that I'm going to attempt to not be offensive, but I don't know what I don't know, and so I might accidentally
Are you just going to play ignorance? Is that what you're going to do?
I am going to plead ignorance all across the board.
Lame. Take a stand. Have some balls.
Well, you know, I don't even really have well-formed opinions about a lot of this stuff.
It's a movie. You're
I'm
just judging the movie.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And we'll introduce our friend here in a few minutes from the AnarchoChristian.com. But
spoilers, you might have a dog in this fight.
I know. Yeah, he does. It's okay though. It's okay. It'll
Absolutely.
be a good conversation.
You can have bias. I don't mind.
Well, everyone's got their own bias and their own moral relativism and their own truth. I'm going to speak my truth. Did I just turn commie? I think I did.
You went commie a long time ago.
Yeah, big time commie. All right. So we had some stellar pre-show content that is available for our Patreon supporters at actualanarchy.com/Patreon. And we've got additional reviews for the show from people. We've been begging for more iTunes reviews. And so that has been working out in our favor. So thank you guys very much for that. We could always use more. So any other listeners, if you're out there, hit us up on those iTunes. Give us some star ratings and some, like little blurbs. They don't have to be true, but, probably better if they are. Because we wouldn't want someone to show up and be like, hey, we got promised in the review that this was a good show, but here you guys are talking a bunch of crap and we don't like this. So like, let it, let the real stuff stick out there, I guess. Is what I'm saying, right? Right, Robert?
Whatever you say, buddy.
All right, well, this will be good. I'm hopped up on Advils and red wine, and let's get into that last nighters portion of the show, shall we? Hey everyone, it's Daniel Elwood and Robert Johnson, the Last Nighters. And the Last Nighters are part of the Launchpad Media, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. This is episode 68 of the show. This is an Easter special. We are doing the Passion of the Christ with Stephen, the Anarcho-Christian. We'll introduce him in just a moment. How you doing, Robert?
Lovely, sir. How are you? Besides old.
I'm old, decrepit, falling apart. And I'm trying to self-medicate, and I think it'll be good. It'll be good.
Just self-medicate your way to success, right?
Well, isn't that how all the rock stars died at 27?
Yeah.
And I'm well past that.
So you're already ahead of the game.
I'm on borrowed time. All right. Well, speaking of borrowed time, we're borrowing time from a friend of ours, Stephen, the Anarcho-Christian. Welcome to the show. Please let everyone know, what your website's about, how they can find your show, and all that good stuff.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on. I run the AnarchoChristian.com website and podcast and Facebook page. And it's pretty much anything about Christian anarchism, from going over, blogs and articles or books and or Bible verses that are relevant to, our topic. And that's about it.
All right. Yeah, that's cool. It seems like a pretty popular niche, actually, way more popular than our niche. And I actually do have in my notes related to the movie we're talking about tonight, The Passion of the Christ, just some general questions about religion and the state and some verses that get referred to in deference to the state. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on those. I don't know if you have specific knowledge in those areas, but I figured I'd throw those against you and see what you have to think on them.
Sure, I'll do my best.
All right, sounds great. Well, we usually start off with a read of the old Google description, and then we get into the analysis of the film. So if you're ready, I will pull that up here. So, The Passion of the Christ, 2004 drama indie film, 2 hours and 7 minutes, directed by Mel Gibson and produced by Mel Gibson and financed by Mel Gibson. Pretty cool story on that, actually, that I want to get into.
Wasn't it also co-written by him?
It was, I believe, yes. So, 7.2 on the IMDb, 49% Rotten Tomatoes, and 4 out of 4 by Roger Ebert when he was still around, and 93% of Google users like it. So a huge disparity between the normal critics and everyone else. Pretty interesting. The description is this. In this version of Christ's crucifixion, based on the New Testament, Judas expedites the downfall of Jesus, played by Jim Caviezel, by handing him over to the Roman Empire's hand-picked officials. To the horror of his mother, Mary Magdalene. To the horror of his mother, Mary Magdalene, whom. All right.
You doing okay? How's it going? How much wine have you had?
How this is written is like bizarre. Okay. To the horror of his mother and Mary Magdalene, whom he saved from damnation, and his disciples, Jesus is condemned to death. He is tortured as he drags a crucifix to nearby Calvary, where he is nailed to the cross. He dies, but not before a last act of grace. Came out February 25th, 2004, directed by Mel Gibson, as we said. Box office of $611.9 million. And an interesting thing about this is not an English language film. This is in kind of an Aramaic, Jewish, Palestinian, Latin, Hebrew type language, which is pretty interesting. I did watch it with the words on Amazon Prime. However, I couldn't make the words quite big enough to read them easily. So I was squint-vision in watching this. Your thoughts on the Google description, Robert?
You still watching movies on your iPad?
I am, but we have a bigger one on the way. It's arriving on Monday.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I think you're right about that. They actually learned their lines in Aramaic and also Latin for the Romans, I believe. Not a whole lot to say about the description. It pretty much describes the plot. It's just about, it takes place over about like a day or two, and then you get some flashbacks, but for the most part, it's just Christ's execution.
Yeah, just a whole bunch of torture, which I remember when this came out, it was very controversial, and I think, I'll have a bunch of questions on this, but let's shift over to Stephen. What are your thoughts on the description so far?
Yeah, like you said on the description, it's pretty straightforward. The movie isn't, I guess, a typical movie where you have, a progressing storyline. It's just one snippet from this event, and with a few little things thrown in there through the flashbacks. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, and gosh, this is going to open up a whole can of worms and stuff. But now I'll work in my comments as we go through. Daniel, where do you want to take this to start off?
Well, we mentioned the Aramaic language that was spoken in the film, and I guess Gibson wanted to do that to have the nuances of the performance shine through in spite of the language. So it's kind of an interesting thing, because it really forces the actors to act not with their words per se. I mean, they are doing a performance, of course, but they have to use like all their other subtle cues and other abilities to relay the story to the audience. Because when this was in theaters, I don't think there were any subtitles. I think it was just straight, this is what you get. You're watching this, and you're not going to understand very many of the words, and you're just going to be impacted by what's going on the screen.
Yeah, I read a little blurb on the Amazon Prime that said Gibson initially didn't want any subtitles at all, and eventually he relented. I'm not sure at what point he did, but I know I appreciated it. I mean, you could have gotten the story just from the actions alone. I wouldn't say the dialogue was necessarily too insightful, but there are some key scenes where absolutely I wanted to know what was being said off the top of my head, especially during the so-called like trial period where Jesus is in front of the Pharisees, and then when Pontius Pilate is taking Jesus aside and kind of talking to him a bit.
Yeah, and he had an interesting Latin/Russian accent, I thought. He's a Russian troll. Stephen, you have any comments on this portion?
Yeah, so I did see this movie in the theater, but that was obviously a long time ago, and I don't remember. I want to say that it did have subtitles, and I could see where maybe you wouldn't need subtitles because it's a story that a lot of people have some of the basic ideas of, so you could just kind of watch these people react and watch their actions and the looks on their faces and things like that to still get it. But I do prefer the subtitles because I guess one thing that to the credit of I think Mel Gibson wrote it or wrote the screenplay or co-wrote it, that there's a lot there that's really good as far as sticking to the words, from the Gospels, and even putting in some things that are references to other parts of the Gospels or other books in the Bible. So where that's concerned, I am glad that I could see it artistically without the subtitles, but I'm glad that they're there.
Yeah, and I think that the performances, you can actually see some of it with like the woman who plays Satan and the apostle Peter, or disciple, right? Peter.
Yeah, at this point, they're disciples.
Yeah. So, he was like watching the show trial, and he was like caressing this column that's holding up the building, and then, acting very, he was trying to display a lot of emotion in that scene. And I think that was purposefully done because of the Aramaic. Like, I think that they amped up to 11, all of the physical performance to try to convey the story. So he was trying to like show that he was very distressed by what he was seeing and tormented. And then he denied Jesus 3 times, as was foretold in the flashback. Anyway,
yeah, Daniel, I think you're right. I think this movie kind of seems like it's kind of presented in a kind of a play format where there's a whole lot of emoting and kind of melodramatic, cranked up to 11 body performances in order to convey to people like in the back row who can't necessarily hear all the dialogue perfectly clearly or something like that.
Yeah, right. I think that you mentioned earlier that maybe a lot of that came from it being in a foreign language to all of the actors. And I agree. I think that there was a lot of that emoting, that larger movements, larger, ways that you can express things. And I'm sure that was intentional, but also assisted by the foreign language.
Right. And I had another point there, and now I have lost it. Caviezel's performance, as he's Jesus and tortured, I mean, he doesn't have a lot to say, but his face and his body being mutilated are on screen a lot. And so he's acting like without words very much in this film. And I thought he did an excellent job, by the way. And I guess he actually injured his shoulder as a result of the filming. And I guess during filming, the assistant director was struck by lightning twice. And then so was Caviezel. So lightning strikes 3 times during the filming of this.
Wow.
So God was angry? What this movie? I don't understand.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. So, Stephen, you saw this in the theater. I just saw it for the first time last night, but I do remember when it came out. And my uncle is, a traditional, conservative Christian Republican type, and he was all about this movie when it came out. He was like, "Oh, you got to go see it. It's so good. It's so amazing," and all that stuff. But all I remember is that there was a bunch of controversy, and I don't recall if it was just because it's a religious movie and Hollywood didn't want to produce it, so Gibson had to go out on a limb and do it himself. But then there's also some criticisms of it being anti-Semitic in some way. And I'm not really sure if I see that here. Maybe I'm just naive. But what would the controversy have been about just in general? And then do you know what the anti-Semitic stuff that was claimed to be about this movie was?
Yeah, I remember that. I remember all of the controversial or all the controversies around it. One was about the blood and the torture in the movie. And the other part was the claim that it's anti-Semitic. And what's interesting is that the movie, I didn't see anything anti-Semitic about it. And the only thing that I could see as maybe a specific is that the Jewish Pharisees are the bad guys. So, I mean, that's the only thing that I could see that I guess could be pointed to, is that it kind of shed like a bad light on them.
But that's not a contrivance of Mel Gibson, right? I mean, that's like the biblical story, correct?
Right, exactly. There wasn't anything in here that was different from the story. And I don't think anything in it that, kind of gave this really negative view onto Jewish people. I didn't see that at all. But the one thing that's weird that doesn't help the case, though, I don't know if you guys remember when Mel Gibson was, after this movie, was, caught times in public making anti-Semitic statements.
Right. He was pulled over drunk and he said that the Jews start all wars or cause all wars, which a lot of people in Hollywood took offense to.
Right. So it doesn't help the controversy already surrounding the movie where that's concerned. But to me, it does seem, I could be wrong, but it does seem completely, separate, that this movie and the way that the characters, are portrayed doesn't seem to come through with any sort of malice toward their ethnicity.
Right. And he was the king of the Jews. He was Jewish himself. So
Yeah.
I guess I don't kind of understand what the issue is. I mean, yeah, the Jewish people, the Pharisees were Jewish. And then when Pontius Pilate was offering to free Jesus or Barabbas, is that his name? Barabbas? Barabbas. And they choose Barabbas, I guess, to spite Jesus or whatever. That is that like the thing that, how do I say this? Is that the thing that, historically speaking, is the crux of why Jewish people have been persecuted since that time? Or is this unrelated? Because I remember it as an offhand comment in a comedy movie, like, I don't know, 20 years ago. They said, "Oh, the Jews killed Jesus" or something, and that's why people are upset at them. Is that what it is?
I think that surprisingly there are people who harbor that feeling, which is really strange because I kid you not, I have had that conversation with people, with Christian American, normal Joe Blow sort of people, where they've made comments like that, the Jews killed Jesus, and I have said, well, that Jesus was Jewish, and they look at me like I'm insane. I'm like, no way, that's not possible. And I mean, so I will say from experience that there are people that do hold that feeling that, quote, the Jews killed Jesus, and they use it in this way to hate Jewish people. And then also simultaneously, they have no idea the ethnicity of Jesus.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So let's go back to the movie a little bit here. The movie, if you're just watching the movie, I understand there's a whole Bible and, all kinds of backstory and other things, but we're not getting that in the movie. So in the movie, it's just a tiny little snippet, but we get the kind of sense that the Pharisees were mostly upset with Jesus because he was kind of upsetting the apple cart. Like, they had this kind of, at least the impression that I got was that the Pharisees were kind of already in place. They're like the entrenched religion, the entrenched, power in this Jewish community. And along comes this young upstart guy who's this new competition. And he's saying some things that are attracting a lot of followers, a lot of attention, but they're kind of, there's, not just competition for ears and souls and eyeballs and whatever, but also that he is particularly like throwing shade at them, right? Because he's saying, like, I mean, I don't know, this is me talking out of my ass, but like, you don't have to go to the temple to pray, right? You can like pray wherever. And maybe I'm also saying some other things. But in the movie, all you get is, he claims he's the Messiah, and how could he possibly be this Messiah? He's not a king, blah, blah, blah. I'm curious more along the lines of, why were they really upset with it? Why did they really want to kill him? So if you could provide some more kind of a back bit on that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. And you basically have it, you have it there, that there's a couple of different things. One, it's, blasphemous to claim that you're God. And Jesus obviously does. And that's a point of tension. And then there are many times, in the Gospels where Jesus is calling out these Pharisees for who they are, that they're liars, and they're not upholding the true faith and the true religion. So that is something that the movie does kind of lose out on, just focusing on that little part and not seeing the years, I think it's about 3 years of build up, to that point with with the Pharisees trying to get him killed.
Okay, so they've been after this guy for a while. He's been a thorn in their side for some time then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about, I think it's 3 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, I kind of wish the movie had told me that, but that's okay. I mean, we still get the idea.
Yeah, I felt like in watching that, I sort of had the general gist of things just from, the Sunday school stuff in general. And my wife made the comment that it was hard to tell the actors apart because they all kind of looked similar, the long hair and the robes and everything. So it was kind of hard to like get the lay of the land and who was who and why they were where they were and doing whatever. Like there's a moment when I think it's John and the two Marys, the mother and Mary Magdalene, are like following the procession, and then all of a sudden they get a hair up to go do an end around and try to like talk to Jesus for a moment. And it's just so that she can say that she's there. But I don't know. It didn't make a lot of sense, like why some of the things were happening. And then like all of a sudden we would be somewhere else. And I couldn't tell if it was a flashback or if it was in the moment, like especially the Judas situation with the little children that were devils. Yeah. Like I couldn't tell if that was a flashback to when like Jesus met Judas, like maybe Judas had been this street person who had leprosy or whatever. I don't know the canon or the story, but when they were displaying it in the film, I was like, oh, this must be back when before events, and he was tormented and he saw demons and whatever, and then he met Jesus and then he betrayed Jesus, and I thought that'd be like the little arc for that story. But no, that was after he had tried to return the money, the 30 pieces of silver, and then all of a sudden he's just like slumped up next to a building, and his face is all cut up, and these kids are like acting like demons to him, and I didn't understand how we got from point A to B in that one. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The movie definitely, I think, assumes a lot for the viewer that you're already very familiar with it, and maybe this is not anything new, but it's just the visual part that the story's always lacking or something like that. And, then specifically with Judas, that's one of the parts in the movie that I don't care for, because there's a few different analogy or illustrations that are made in the movie, and the symbolism that's made, and or artistic license, and that's one of the ones that I don't care for, because it's not biblical at all. That's just I guess Mel Gibson trying to show the tortured soul of Judas or something, but I think that it distracted from the movie on the movie level, and then I think that it distracts as well from the actual gospel message that you would get from reading it. If you're reading it after watching the movie and you're like, well, that part wasn't in here, where's that part? Or it just is confusing. So I don't think that was good for a couple of different reasons.
Yeah, for me, if you're doing flashbacks, you got to make it obvious that they're flashbacks, unless you're doing one of those clever movies that like it's messing with you. But this is neither, right? This isn't like trying to mess with us. It's not inceptioning us. Mm-hmm. So I think it would have been better had the flashbacks been more, I guess, on their face, hey, this is a flashback, everyone. And not just, hey, moments later and across town for some reason. and he looks totally different now, by the way. It was just weird. Anyway, Roberts, I'm sure you've got something.
Yes, sir. Well, I've got all kinds of things. It's just a question on what we want to get into.
Let's talk about Pontius Pilate a little bit, because he actually brought up the whole my truth thing when he was explaining to his wife why he was kind of in a catch-22 with he's going to have a rebellion no matter what he does with Jesus. And then he mentions that he's been putting down rebellions for 11 years in this wretched outpost. So I thought that was very apropos of, that's what an extension of government force is to quell rebellion and prevent people from living free.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I really liked Pilate in this movie. I thought that the actor did a good job. And as far as the dialogue, it stayed true to the things that were said in the Gospels, but also the things that were added. I think like you're pointing out, that they're very true to the historical, events that were happening, and just the nature of having this military occupation.
There's so many different ways we could do this. Okay, I'm going to talk about just movies in general and character. So there's a bunch of different ways you can look at art in movies, and I'm just going to look at this as if it's a normal movie. I understand it's not a normal movie. This is a movie that was made as a retelling of a historical type, story that's already been told. And so it depends on the audience having a lot of kind of in-depth knowledge. It's made for a certain audience, right? It's made for an audience of people that want to go and learn more about, say their faith or reaffirm their faith or something like that, or glorify the origins of their religion. But for me, as an atheist film critic, I'm just going to analyze it from a movie point of view. And that may be unfair, so you can just discount everything we're going to say. It's fine. I really don't mind it. But for me, Pontius Pilate is the best character in this movie by far. Pontius Pilate, actually, you reveal a little bit of his humanity. His humanity shows up in this film. He's the only character with any kind of conflict, any kind of internal conflict, and his decisions affect the plot of the movie. No other character in this film does anything. Jesus, for being the central character, pretty much just stands there or gets beat up The entire movie. Mary Magdalene, let's see here. Judas actually does something, but we don't get any kind of insight to his character. But Pontius Pilate, you can tell he's torn. He's obviously some government bureaucrat guy, but he doesn't want to murder this guy who hasn't done nothing. It's clearly just like this religious competition beef going on. And he's like, come on, I'm going to do anything I can. He even offers up Barabbas to be like, oh, come on, you're not really going to pick Barabbas over this guy. This guy didn't do nothing. You're going to take him? But they hate him so much. And he's like, fine. Ultimately, finally, he goes, okay, fine, go ahead and kill him. But it is with great reluctance after trying out every other possibility with which he does that. So, yeah, I was trying to think, who's the main character in this movie? It should be Jesus. It should be his story. It's his death. But it only takes place over like 2 days, maybe 1 or 2 days. And we don't get enough from Jesus as a protagonist. Ideally, a protagonist is somebody who acts. They affect the plot by their actions. They do things. Now, there can be times when doing nothing is an interesting decision. And there are times in this movie where he chooses to, like when Pontius asks him, what do you want me to do here? I don't really know. I mean, I want to let you go. And Jesus is like, well, you can't do nothing to me. I mean, you don't have any authority. And the real bad people are the ones that threw me into your hands and that sort of thing. And he basically is saying like, you got nothing on me. You have no power over me. So that can be an interesting thing. But when you do that the entire movie, when you are just like this whipping post the entire movie, it's just not interesting. He's not an interesting protagonist. He's not an interesting character to me because he's flawless, right? He's like Mr. Virtue, and I understand he's like the source of one of the world's most powerful, popular religions. So of course he's going to have great virtue. He's not going to be like a flawed protagonist that would be more interesting. But for me, this is almost like a Pontius Pilate movie. Like whenever he's on screen, I'm interested in what's happening. And when he's not on screen, I'm less interested. So for me, there's issues there. But anyway, that was my little rant on that. I'm sure Daniel might have some thoughts, or Stephen can yell at me or something. I don't know. But anyway, go ahead, guys.
No, I think you couched that carefully enough to where if we're just looking at this movie without any extra, like foreknowledge and awareness of the storyline,
right? Like I'm sure if you go back in time to Jesus doing all the things that Jesus is famous for doing, I'm sure he'd make a great protagonist to all kinds of different movies. But since we just get this little snippet, here where he's not really doing much but dying, it doesn't make for a dramatic narrative. So anyway.
Yeah, now I will say that the amount of punishment on display in this movie is incredible. Like just immense. Like my shoulder.
Yeah, he should have died a couple times.
Yeah, my shoulder and my back hurts just from being 41. And he's sitting there getting whipped with the cat o' nine tails like 50 times, and this is after being beaten with sticks. And it's like how's he even conscious? That's pretty incredible. That feat of that. But can
we talk about how cartoonish the baddies the Roman guards are? They are absolutely like howling, cackling, perverse psychopaths. And I understand you got to have villains in a movie, but it seemed like almost every single one of them was just being a guard to get their rocks off of hurting people. And they took some severe pleasure when they were beating this man to death.
I wonder if, Satan, the woman, was walking through that first torture scene a little bit, and she had that little devil baby, demon baby. I wonder if that was supposed to symbolize that she was sort of amplifying their enjoyment of that, or like making them do that more than they otherwise would have. Like the whole story is like, this is all part of God's plan, right? And it's all sort of preordained, and Jesus knows it's going to happen, and he foretells a lot of this stuff. He tells the disciples like, hey, this and this and this is going to happen. And then he's willing to accept that this will happen, and he goes through with it. But I'm wondering if this was sort of like behind the scenes, out of the control of those individuals per se, like they were destined to do these things, not of their own volition, not of their own individual choices, but like sort of orchestrated in a way. Do you kind of follow what I'm saying? Like it feels like this is all preordained to happen. And Jesus even says in this, they know not what they do. And he knows what the fate is going to be. Side note, and I've always wondered this, the whole crux of this is that Jesus dies for sin, and they torture him and crucify him. But how does that absolve, Stephen, this is directed to you, how does this absolve sin in the world of man And why would the devil make this deal that gets reneged on 3 days later?
I guess I'm not familiar with what you're saying, that this deal is that something that came out of the movie, and maybe I missed that.
Well, I'm just speaking in more, I guess, generalish terms,
Oh, okay.
like Jesus dies for the sins of man, and that so they don't go to hell, right? Well, this must be a bargain struck, right? Like,
No, there wasn't. And it sounds like it's possible that maybe you're mixing the story of Job with this story where Job starts out with the devil approaching God and telling him that, you protect Job, let me do something, bad to him, and he'll reject you, and so that's the way that the story of Job starts off. There wasn't anything like that, I guess, in the Bible dealing with Jesus or anything like that, where there was some sort of deal struck between God or Jesus and the devil. There's one thing in the movie where with the snake, when he's praying at the garden at the beginning of the movie, where he steps on the snake's head, and that you won't find written in the gospel accounts, but what it is it was put in by Mel Gibson as as symbolism for way back in Genesis. God lets Satan know that there will be a Messiah that will crush his head, crush the head of the serpent. So we have that as kind of a symbolism in that part of the movie. But getting back to the original question, there isn't at all a part where God, and or Jesus and the devil.
okay, you broke up just a little bit there.
Yeah, like right at a key point. I didn't quite understand that last sentence you did there.
There's not a deal made by God or made by Jesus with the devil. That's not something that happens in the Bible at all. That could be something that is confused with the story of Job a little bit, but with Jesus, there's not a deal struck that the devil's lost 3 days later or anything like that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I've got to say that's a new one on me too, Dan. I've never heard that, some kind of deal with the devil. There's the whole devil tempting Christ out in the desert, right? But other than that, I don't know.
Right, and that's that's something else that maybe would, Robert, I think you're mentioning, for a bigger movie with more development and stuff like that. That might be a good thing. That it might have been good if we had something like that. But otherwise, I really didn't care for any of the symbolism with the devil character in the movie. I really didn't care for it at all. I thought it was kind of distracting, and it didn't hold a lot of significance to the actual story.
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of payoff with the devil's involvement.
No, you just get that really terrible scene at the end where the devil's on her knees, screaming, and I don't know. I didn't care for it.
And then there's the point where the devil's holding that creepy old baby. What was that about?
Yeah, that was completely 100% Mel Gibson on that one. That's not in the story. That's not in the Gospels. That's not, something.
Is it symbolism for something, or?
It's his symbolism. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not actually symbolism from the Bible or, some sort of prophecy or anything like that from the Bible. It's 100% Mel Gibson's symbolism.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting that you say that, just because I remember when this movie came out and Gibson was promoting the movie, and he was saying that this movie is 100 literal translation from scripture. They didn't add anything. This is exactly what happened. And that can't possibly be true, because I'm sure all this dialogue isn't in the Bible, and they're taking some artistic license. They've got to, I'm sure, but
yeah, that's not true. There was quite a bit of license there. They did have a lot of key dialogue in the movie, so that's a really good thing. But then there were also other things that were added to it that were either references to other Bible verses, or just something that they threw in there to kind of make another reference.
Gotcha.
So was the devil who, one of her first lines is, "Who's your daddy?" which I thought was kind of fun. But at the end, that final moment after Jesus has died, and then she's down on her knees, like you said, screaming, is that supposed to be representative of her being in hell at that point? And was that in the film's specifics? Was that the moment when Satan was banished to hell, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I was trying to actually look at that yesterday, or a couple days ago when I was rewatching the movie, and trying to get an idea of what exactly is Mel Gibson trying to show us in that scene. I wasn't sure if the devil was in hell or if it was like this like weird dimensional thing, because the devil was already there around everybody during the scourging. I wasn't really sure. And like I said, I just think the whole thing was a little bit distracting. I will say the one thing that is significant biblically is that, this idea of when Jesus dies on the cross, he's victorious over sin, death, and the devil. So that's the one thing about that scene where it takes place at that moment when he dies, that is significant. But the way that it's portrayed, I just
Interesting. Back to the Pontius Pilate and being torn on what to do. He tries to appease the Pharisees and the Jews who don't like Jesus, who hate him, with torturing him, but with severe punishment, but don't kill the man, is what he says. And so that's where they take him to this place, and he's beaten with reeds or sticks, and then the cat of nine tails and all of that, which is horrific. Especially the rib shot where they're like ripping the side. Ugh. But I wonder if he had acquiesced to their demands originally to have him crucified, if it would have been less torturous for Jesus. Like Pontius chose this other path in hopes of saving his life by nearly killing him, versus just going straight to crucifixion, where he would have just not been tortured in that way, but still murdered.
Right, because those other two guys were not tortured before they were put up on the cross. I mean, it's still not great. You're still getting your hands and feet nailed and hung up there. And
you're definitely going to die up there. They don't just kind of put them up there for a few days and then bring them back down after getting a sunburn or something. It's the Romans, used the crucifixion, and interestingly enough, we even get the word excruciating from the crucifixion. So the pain that these people are put through already, just like you said, the other two thieves that are on the cross, they're eventually going to die. And maybe there's something to it where Jesus does die within a matter of a few hours, rather than being up there for a couple of days. Because if the way that someone would die up on the cross could take days, because it's a matter of asphyxiation and trying to push yourself up on this cross while you're nailed to it. So it could take quite a while. And I wouldn't be surprised if the scourging is something that kind of, once he was crucified, it did speed up up to the point of death.
Right. And the most horrifying part to me anyway, was because I used to run a lot. Like I ran a few marathons, and my knees would give me problems. And so when they whacked their knees with the sledgehammer, while they're hung up, and I assume that's to prevent them from supporting themselves any longer.
Right.
That was just like, oh, like my my stomach dropped at that one, because like that hit home for me.
Yeah, visually that was that was well done. I thought.
Yeah, that was like you didn't pay your gambling debt or something. Or your taxes.
So, Dan, let's move into your questions on your biblical verses and the state.
Well, before we get to that, just more on the visualization of the acting in this.
Okay.
There's a few things that are just like over the top, like in your face, like I'm doing this because it's well known and commonplace. And one of them was he washes his hands of the situation by literally washing his hands.
Yeah.
And then Jesus draws the line in the sand when he saves Mary Magdalene, I guess, from stoning, right? Is that what the Pharisees, or the Jewish people, the Pharisees are throwing towards Jesus, or like sort of?
He stands in front of the mob, yeah.
Right.
Draws the line in the sand, saving Mary Magdalene, yeah.
Yeah, so those are just a couple of moments that I just thought were like almost comically like, oh, okay, obviously, okay. Like, oh, okay, the line in the sand, all right. Wash his hands of it, okay.
It's very literal interpretations.
Right. Yeah. Super literal. And
well, if he's making the movie to not have subtitles, that would pretty much spell it out for people, spell it out for the audience if you don't know what's being said.
Those parts are, in the Bible, in the gospel accounts as actually happening.
So is that the origin of those sayings then?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know if they're the origin, but that's something that happened. Literally happened. I guess the best way I could say is that the accounts, the narratives, the gospel accounts, they don't say that he washed his hands of it. I think he literally does do it as a symbol to the people, the people in the crowd.
Right, like this is on you. I'm not doing this, even though he kind of is doing it, but he's giving in to them.
Now, scripturally, Stephen, is the representation of Pilate, you think, pretty much accurate? Because he seems to be the voice of reason in the whole situation.
I thought that Yeah, I thought that the movie portrayed him very well, and I can read the accounts and feel just as much for Pilate in the accounts as you do when you watch the film.
Because I mean, when he first says, what do you want me to do with this guy? And they're like, crucify him. He like reacts with horror, like, what? You're
Yeah.
gonna kill this guy? What did he do?
Yeah, and he really did send him back and forth, and talk to his wife who had a dream, and he had those one-on-one conversations with Jesus, and had those great lines about what is truth. That was all something that that Pilate really did have. That is in the gospel accounts.
I thought it was interesting the pass off to King Herod, hoping that would satisfy the crowd, because, like we said earlier, either decision was going to cause more rebellion and uprising. And he goes to King Herod, which is just like this hedonistic kind of pleasure palace with a cheetah.
Yeah, it's like Jabba the Hutt's palace. Do you know what was the power dynamics in this situation? I mean, Herod was the king of this area, but then the Romans ruled it jointly, or what was the situation there? I thought it was a weird thing to be able to just be like, well, let's see if Herod can handle this.
Yeah, go over there in that line. Bureaucracy, right?
Yeah, that is the way that like the Romans handled a lot of their
Hang on, stop and restart what you just started saying. You were cutting out again.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that historically that is significant. That is the way that the Romans handled a lot of their far outposts. That they would have their, I don't know how large their legions were in these areas, but they would let the people of those areas still kind of retain a lot of their normal practices and even have their local representative.
Okay. Yeah, you kind of seem that way, like. Mm-hmm. Like Pilate's probably where the buck stops, but he's like, well, but there's these other groups that have power too, and I'm going to try and work within all this, not just be lording over all the power all the time.
Well, and we know that that if you are seeking to dominate these areas for their resources and for their tax revenue, that sometimes it's better to kind of have your people just happy enough to keep on maintaining their normal lifestyle rather than just throwing them all into a camp.
Yeah, have the guy that's robbing them look like them. That makes way better.
Yeah, and better to milk the cows than to slaughter them.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. I had another question, but I can
do it, Daniel. Come on, do it. Ask your question.
Well, I got another one for you too. While you're thinking about that I think was interesting. Around the scene with Pilate and you've already mentioned it, but it's Barabbas. And he's an interesting person because, and a lot of the state stuff ties into this guy as well, because the Bible actually refers to him as kind of this patriot sort of guy. And, Pilate references these uprisings before, and that's what Barabbas was in prison for. He wasn't just a thief or anything like that, but he was a murderer, and he had participated and led some of these uprisings. So that's why Rome doesn't have any problem with killing that guy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in the film they just say, oh, he's this scurvy murderer rapist guy, pretty much. He's the worst guy we can think of, and that's why we're going to offer him and Jesus, and obviously you'll pick Jesus until they don't.
Yeah, I wish they would have gotten a little bit more into him, but they might not have been able to do that without having some sort of extra narrative worked into it to kind of give a little bit more description about him.
All right. So if we could get a little bit political, Jesus is a figure who has been used for political purposes probably for the past 2,000 years, probably. But people on the both left and right and everybody else like to use, the Jesus for their own, backing up their own arguments and whatnot. So a lot of people debate whether or not Jesus was a socialist. And there is a quote in this movie where he says, love one another, love your neighbor and that sort of thing. And I think that the socialists take that to mean, well, that means we just got to share all our stuff. And that's all socialism is anyway. So
by force.
Right. No, they don't talk about the force part so much. So that's my point, is that, if I was going to interpret that, I would say love is not pointing a gun at your neighbor to fund the things you want. But Stephen, I want to hear your take on whether or not Jesus was a socialist.
Yeah, he was not a socialist, just for the easy. And there's a lot of people that do, I've read the arguments on that he's a socialist because of loving your neighbor. And there's a few other things where Marx and Lenin, I believe, quoted Jesus, for these things about. They escape me right now, the particular verses that they did use. So yeah, it's a common thing. And but you're absolutely right. We know that socialism is always, no matter how it's explained, but it always comes down to the gun pointed at somebody to take care of the masses. So no, Jesus was not a socialist. He did not give us some sort of social economic plan to follow that would be socialist or communist or anything like that. It is a mistake that a lot of people.
Yeah, it's quite disgusting. I mean, if you take some phrase like, love your friends and neighbors and love one another as I love you and you love me and that sort of thing, and to turn it into your own political things, and that's why we need to expropriate money from you at gunpoint. It's gross.
Yeah, and then
But Daniel, did you?
Another thing that they go after is Jesus throwing somebody out of the temple, right? Because they're charging temple taxes or something like that. But it's the tax collectors that they're throwing out. Is that correct?
No, it's actually not tax collectors in that story. So the temple was where you would go to make your sacrifices and pray. And these people had set up, they called them money changers, and they would set up these tables, and they were profiting off of the people that would come in and not have a good, I think for the most part, a good sacrifice to present into the temple. And I know that there's been a lot written on some of the specifics that they were handling that was particularly atrocious. But when Jesus goes in there and he tells them to leave, and he says, "This is my Father's house," and he has them leave, it's because that they were taking advantage of people in this spiritual sense. So it's not just about profit, which is where you're going to find the socialists are going to end up on this side of the story, that it was just guys that were making a profit in the temple. And that's not the case. They were disgracing his Father's temple, and that is why they were removed.
Okay, so they were cheating. They weren't just like, because when you first described it, it sounded like, oh, they're just providing something that people want.
Yeah, right. They were doing it, in a bad sort of way. They were. I'm trying to think of the best way to say it, but yeah, they were cheating the people that were there, and just it makes a mockery of the temple and what it was.
Okay, interesting. The Marx thing. I'm not surprised that he would mix in some verses in, because he was trying to abolish religion, wasn't he? Was it not Marx that called religion the opiate of the masses?
Yeah, I believe you're right.
Yeah, and then one of the planks of the manifesto was to abolish religion, which almost sounds fascistic and Hitlerian or Mussolinian, like nothing above the state, nothing but the state.
Yeah, that was the what Stalin did, right? He abolished the church out of Soviet Union, and so the national religion apparently was atheism, is what they called it, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But then that gets thrown at atheists' feet, as if atheists are all a bunch of psychopathic, murdering communists. That's not the case of that either. Oh, it might have been Lenin who abolished it. Anyway,
moving on. Religion.
I mean, yes, he didn't abolish the state. What am I talking about?
No, he amped it up.
Cranked it up to 11.
Cranked up the state to 11. Well, while we're on the subject of just generalities here, Stephen, what do you think is the state of the church in the United States at present? From my reading of things, it looks as if there's a lot more conflation and propagation within the government and military worship that's been brought into religion in some ways. So a lot of statism kind of sticks into even sermons that I hear about. Not that I don't go to church, but there are people like in the Tom Woods group that I interact with, and they talk about when they go to church, they're like, oh, the preacher said this, and it's like this super status thing. Or even like Pope Francis and his advocacy for socialistic type stuff. What's your read on things? Because I thought that religion was more of a split from statism in a way, in the past anyway.
Yeah, I think that it's the current state of the church is very much, way too closely connected to the state. And I don't just mean that as this organizational sort of thing, but even just down to the end of that is putting all of their faith in the state and in a voting republic system, and they really have intermingled their faith with God with their faith in the state. And it's my observation, in my opinion, that the state is really the one winning out with that person's faith. And it's very unfortunate. You have your people that are socialist and and using Jesus as the symbol for socialism. I would say that I think in the United States it's mainly on the other side of it, where Jesus is this symbol for this rising nation, and we've had presidents refer to use biblical terms to refer to the nation. And it was prominent back in the Civil War, and it was prominent in the Cold War, and it's prominent now, where you see so many people referring to Donald Trump as some sort of David figure or Cyrus figure, and picking out these heroes in the Bible to relate him to. It's like I said, it's just faith has been co-opted by too many Christians, and their faith, they may use words like Jesus and Bible and God, but so much of it is actually directed toward the state.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of times they'll justify things with phrases or verses that are like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, or they'll refer to Romans 13. But I think, layman's terms here, I think that they're misinterpreting those because they were kind of the opposite of what they use them for today in their justifications. Can you explain what those two things mean, and if there's any others that you can think of that have this similar kind of situation?
Yeah, those are definitely the most prominent objections that people will have, toward Christian anarchism. And yes, these words were said and written down. I want to say close to 400 years before the Christian church started to mix with the state, and that was with you'll hear Emperor Constantine used a lot for that, where he made it illegal to persecute Christians. Where after this time of Jesus and up until Constantine, Christians were under a horrible persecution, where they were murdered in the Colosseum for sport and in the most horrific way. And so there's this interesting dynamic with Constantine where he ended that, and the Caesars to kind of follow their emperors to follow him. They ended that, but then that also brought the church into the political realm, and it's been there ever since, but in various different ways, where we have the growth of the Roman Catholic Church, and we have different Eastern Orthodox religions that are connected with their particular states, and then even what you can see here with in the current United States, where it's this evangelical patriot that you see today. I guess we can speak in generalities. I think you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, it's been intermingled ever since then, and in various ways, and it's it's something that is a mistake of what those verses and what in the position of the Christian and the church. It's a mistake.
Okay, and if I could rephrase the questions more pointedly, why is render unto Caesar not a justification for taxation? Because it seems to be used as such. And why is Romans 13 not a justification for blindly following your elected leaders?
Yeah. Yes, because that is the way that they are used. So with Romans 13, it's interesting because if you look at Romans 12 and Romans 13, the Romans 13 part that is always thrown out there is the first 7 verses of Romans. And these books, when they were actually written, Romans was just a letter. And these chapter breaks weren't a part of the original letter. So these chapter breaks were put in there, and they're great for referencing, things very quickly, in the Bible. But in this particular case, there's a little bit of difficulty here where Romans 12 and Romans 13 are actually part of a long thought. And because of where the chapter break is, it's very, very easy to just ignore Romans 12. And so it's something that I do like to point out to people whenever they bring me the Romans 13 thing. If you look at Romans 12 does quite a bit to show you the way that a Christian is supposed to act. And then in Romans 13, we get some description of how the state acts. And it is in a drastic contradiction to the way that a Christian is supposed to act. And then the remainder of Romans 13 again goes further into the way a Christian is supposed to act. So it just shows the dangers of just looking at something out of context. And if I could just narrow it down to the way that the Christian is supposed to act with Romans 13 in mind, we're told to not, start a revolt. It's not that we're supposed to worship Caesar or the emperor or anything like that, but we're not supposed to start a revolt. And then with the rendering unto Caesar thing as well, that's an interesting thing because the context of Jesus, the question that's given to Jesus that he answers that way, it specifically says that they're trying to catch him. And you see it in the movie too, where they're saying, they're saying that he wants to, undermine Caesar and things like that. And he's telling everyone not to pay their taxes. Well, that doesn't actually happen. And that is the claims that they use to try to get him crucified, but that's not what he actually does do. And the render unto Caesar part, it's a shame because there's another part directly after that where he says, and render unto God the things that are God's. And what Jesus is really ultimately doing here is he is saying, this tax thing is not what I'm here for. It's beneath me. This is not important. What is important is what I'm here for. What is important is salvation.
Well, this is interesting because I can almost read into both of these, almost this horseshoe where you start off with them justifying taxation with the render unto Caesar. Then you're explaining, well, he's basically saying, don't worry about it. And so in a way, it's like pay your taxes because it's not important. And then the Romans 13 one, it's like, so they're sort of using it wrong. But then you're also, kind of backs around to, well, don't start a rebellion. Well, that's like the ultimate check on government. So if you can't have a rebellion, then they can kind of do whatever, right? It's like a blank check.
Well, there's quite a few things in the New Testament that are hard. And that's hard for us because we do have this sense of justice. We do have this sense of right and wrong. And we're told Jesus is the ultimate example of the way that we're supposed to be. And Jesus was not guilty of any of the things that he was put on the cross for. And he wasn't even guilty in the spirituals as well. So we're told as Christians to, imitate Christ. We're told as Christians to turn the other cheek. We're told as Christians that if someone is to steal to steal our shirt, then to give them our jackets, and it's this way of living that it's difficult sometimes. It's difficult to explain. It's difficult to even, balance it with our sense of justice.
It's almost like, well, they're robbing me, so I'll give them even more.
It doesn't make the robbing not robbery though. It doesn't make it not theft.
All right. Interesting. Well, we are getting, towards the end of our allotted time for the show, so we should probably venture back toward the movie and then get into the final summaries and reviews. Unless, Robert, you have any comments before we do that?
Well, I could comment on some of the things you guys are saying. I guess I could also save it for my final summary. I'll just briefly mention that, as this heretic atheist guy, one of my favorite things about religion, and what makes it so sad, my favorite things about religion is that it is a check. It's like a bulwark against government, because you have God's law, which is above man's law, or at least it should be. And I know a lot of Christian sects that I've talked about here on the show before are really good at that and have really maintained that tradition that, man's going over and doing all this other stuff, but we still have the primacy of the Lord's word, because ultimately, government's just made out of people who are all fallible and whatnot. But if you have this idea that there's this, all-knowing, all-powerful creator being that is handed down, the right way to be, that should be some sort of a immunization against the tyrannies of government. Because if you're taught, no, this is how you should be, and then you see these government people doing this other thing, this horrible thing, you could recognize it, right? You got the good, and without the good, you can't recognize the bad. So you got the good, and then you see the bad, and you go, oh. But like Stephen was saying earlier, it's really kind of fallen off. I mean, I worry that, as much as, I'm not a religious person, but I recognize that as you lose religion and as people let their faiths kind of fall to the wayside, I worry that they don't pick up statism as a far, far, far more dangerous religion.
Yeah, it seems to be the most popular one right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Stephen, feel free to respond, and then let's get into our final summary and review on the Passion of the Christ.
Some of that did break up there, and but I think if I start rambling, cut me off. But I think that for the most part, what you're saying is very true. That people do pick up on statism, and rather than the truths that are explained, in the New Testament. And unfortunately, that's true. There is hope, though. There are plenty of people that are Christian anarchists, and most people weren't born into it. So everybody's come from either the right or the left, and there is hope.
That's right. With the spread, the power of information, hopefully turn the tide. All right, let's get into our summary reviews. I'll start it off. Why not? So for me, this movie, if you're going to make a historical movie, the story that's been told before, you got to do it kind of an interesting way. Like I remember the movie Lincoln, which is about this psychopathic murderer. And we all knew how the story ended. So you had to tell the story. You had to get the people engaged in the characters in order for you to be engaged as an audience. Like, we already know how the story's going to end. So I need to be able to connect with these people on a human level in order to be along for the ride and to go along and, see how the movie ends and whatever. This movie, I think, is already banking on the pre-established character that everybody already knows. And they already knows kind of the history and the lore. And so you go into this movie already knowing a whole lot about the characters involved, because this movie doesn't really give you anything. So for me, kind of as an outsider, even though I was raised in a Christian part of the world, and I grew up, going to church, and so I know a bit about it. But strictly speaking, from a film critic's viewpoint, this movie just has no narrative weight. There's no protagonist that does anything. There's very little that actually happens. He gets kidnapped. There's a show trial, and then he's executed. And that's it. So for me, this movie wasn't that great. I will say that, I generally like Mel Gibson's stuff. I think he's a perfectly competent filmmaker. He's not perfect by any means, but I do enjoy his work for the most part. I was kind of surprised that this movie, I don't know if it would do so well today. I don't know. That's an interesting idea. If it was released today, how well would it do? But at the time, it was like the number one R-rated movie, or the biggest money-making R-rated movie for a long time. So it's doing something right. I mean, I assume it was, cashing in on name recognition and all the controversy surrounding it. And because there's been all kinds of Bible stories that have been done that have done fairly well. I mean, Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments, I don't know how well it was, but I'm sure it's kind of a cinematic classic in a way. But anyway, I'm babbling. So let me just clear it up here. I wouldn't say this was a great movie. I appreciate, though, the spirit with which it was made and the idea that you're going to make something different, but I don't think it's like a standalone movie. You can't just watch this movie without knowing any of the backstory. You can't be like an alien coming down and watching this movie and going, oh, that was good, because you're not getting anything. There's no character development. There's no arc. Nobody has any kind of learns anything, changes in any way. So none of that traditional kind of storytelling for this little slice of life, which would make sense. I mean, it'd be weird if it was, 12 hours and you fundamentally change yourself as a character. Whatever. It happens, but it's weird. Anyway, I'm going to give this a mediocre, just like a 5. It's not great, but it's not like terrible either. So I'm going to stop talking. Somebody else take over. Sorry, everybody.
All right, Steven. So feel free to give your summary and a score out of 10. You can go decimal point deep if you'd like.
I don't mind the movie. Visually, it looks really good. I thought, I guess it would be the cinematography. I thought that it looked really good. There are a lot of aspects to it that I do really appreciate, as far as hitting on dialogue that just has to be a part of this story. There were, however, several parts that I think are just absolutely confusing, even outside of the movie just being this one little snippet. The parts with Satan, and maybe even some of the flashbacks, the way that they were, if you're not familiar with those parts of the story, it could be confusing. I think overall, and this may be surprising, I mean, I can see why it did so well. Like you said, the name recognition, but not just for Mel Gibson, but for a movie about Jesus and about the Passion. But I don't think that it's the greatest movie, because other than the visual issues that you encounter from seeing Jesus beaten, it's going to affect you emotionally. But personally, I would rather listen to a really well articulated sermon about the passion that really drives home the gospel message that I think is lost out in this movie. I think that the gospel of Jesus being born and living according to the scriptures and dying on the cross for our sins and then being resurrected is lost in this movie. And again, I would personally rather just sit through a well-worded sermon about the subject, about the passion, than watching this movie. In one way, like I said, it's visually, entertaining or eye-opening, but it's a bit gratuitous as well. So if I were to rate it, I guess I might go a point over at a 6, but that I wouldn't be recommending this right away. I would rather recommend a lower budget movie about the entire gospel of Luke or John rather than.
All right, interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, I almost want to say what those two said because they're both pretty smart. But I remember the controversy, hadn't seen it until last night, and after reading about like what it took for Mel Gibson to get this thing actually off the ground and out into the world, I got to give him a lot of credit. I mean, that's some cojones to do this because it seemed to be very anti-establishment. Like the normal Hollywood people did not want this movie made. They didn't want to support it at all. So I want to give it a little bit of bonus points for that. Also, I think that, as you guys were saying, if you just watch the movie and you don't know anything about what's going on, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense. And even if you do know what's going on, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense in some of the parts. But I think in the context of this is a story that, I don't know, a few billion people are familiar with. I don't know how many Christians there are in the world, but it's one of the major religions. And I think that they're kind of banking on the audience having that foreknowledge coming in and watching this and seeing it depicted, in gratuitous detail, because they've probably sat through those sermons like you were talking about, Stephen, those good sermons that talk about the meaning behind it all and what it, like how powerful it is for Christians. And then to see it in this visceral way, I don't know, just kind of like symbiotically in my mind, it just makes sense that something like this gets made as a passion project in and of itself about the passion. And I think that, I don't know, I actually enjoyed it. It's hard to say you enjoy something that's about torturing a guy. But I guess what I'm saying, it's really well done. And I'm glad it got made. And I'm glad I saw it. So I'm going to go with a 7 on this. And I don't care what you guys think. I think it was pretty good.
I can't argue with any of that. Thank you, Stephen, for all your comments and your insight. You've been a fantastic guest. Appreciate that. Daniel, you're not wrong either. Everybody's right on their opinions. It was good.
It's a good thing we got an opinion show, because otherwise we'd be in trouble. All right. Well, I think next week we're going to do a non-Easter special, an Earth Day special, but instead of talking about Earth, let's get away from Earth and go out on a Galaxy Quest. I think we're going to have Anarchist Mom join us for that one next week, the Tim Allen movie. And I think that will be interesting and fun to talk about. If you're good with that, Robert.
I am totally good with that. I don't remember that movie having any. It's been a million years since I've seen it, so I couldn't even tell you the plot. So I'm sure it'll be great. Yeah, I mean, there's other things around it. Tim Allen, there's Rainn Wilson, there's probably some other people. I know it's like a send up of Star Trek, so it should be good.
Yeah. I think as we've demonstrated on our last show about dodgeball, we can talk about anything for about an hour. And I think that might be our new tagline.
What a great selling point.
So, Stephen, again, thank you for being our guest on The Last Nighters, episode 68 of the show. Why don't you remind the audience what your site's about and where they can find it, and then we'll say goodnight. All
right. Again, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this movie and the important aspects to it, as well as our opinions on the story and the cinematography. But if you want to catch up with me, Facebook.com, AnarchoChristian, Twitter, AnarchoChristian, AnarchoChristian.com is our website where you can find articles and links to the podcast, AnarchoChristian. So feel free to hit me up on any of the social media sites or through the email address on the website, and I'll be happy to talk about anything.
All right, sounds great. Well, thanks again. And thank you, audience. Remember to give us likes and subscribes and shares and give us reviews on iTunes. It helps bump up our profile there and get us recommended to other people. We got 3 reviews in the last week, which is pretty awesome. So it shows you the power of asking. So we could use a few more if you got them. Smoke them if you got them. And I'll say good night from last night. Thanks, everyone. All right, and we'll continue the Actual Anarchy podcast for a few more minutes. This is episode 125 of the show. We have Anarcho-Christian on, talking about Passion of the Christ. And I can't believe it's not butter. We didn't talk about a very important event that happened on Monday, or a significant event. Stephen, your take on the Notre Dame fire. What do you hear? What do you know about this?
Yeah, it definitely a big event. And so myself personally, I'm not a Catholic, so I don't have a lot of emotional, connections or ties to the building itself. But I do recognize its architectural beauty and historical significance, and it was sad to see that happen. And I don't think anyone was injured in it, and so that I'm very grateful. But it's a shame that such a old and historically significant building it went up like that.
Yeah, and I heard there's like a computer glitch is what it's getting blamed on. I understand that there was like renovations going on at the time. I don't know what that means.
You can see the scaffolding in some of the photos, and man, I just hate to be that guy. Dumped over the paint thinner and into the candle or whatever.
Yeah,
you'd think they'd have regulations around that.
There should be a law,
especially in France, right? Probably some 3 union workers that would be like, all right, we're gonna set the candles way over here. You set the paint thinners way over there. You don't knock them down. Anyway, some people are saying it's rather convenient because there's the yellow vest protests that have been going on, and it gets like almost no media coverage. And I guess Marcon was slated to speak about something related to some issues in France. And again, I don't know much about it, but some people are saying that it was rather convenient that this occurred because then he was able to not make that speech, and some of the focus got shifted.
Are we putting on our tinfoil hats?
Yeah, total tinfoil hat time. Because, and I'll go a step further. And I don't, man, I almost don't want to say this, but when 9/11 happened, it was the attack on the financial center of the West.
Yes.
This seems like a religious center of the West, or the Western society. And I can't help but draw a parallel there. I'm not saying
this is obviously an accident, though. This isn't like an act of terrorism, right?
Is it though? I don't know.
Is it?
Yeah, I don't. I don't see that. I'm all for a good conspiracy, but I don't think that Notre Dame necessarily has that level of importance to the, I guess, the faith. Overall in general. Now the yellow vest thing, that was actually the first thing I thought of when I saw it go up in flames. I thought. That was the first thing I was asking, was, did it have anything to do with the yellow vest? And I don't think that it did, from everything that I can tell. And I think that there were some pretty quick accusations that it might be, Islamic terrorist related, but I haven't seen anything really come out that really pointed that direction either. Like I said, with the scaffolding around the building and the removal of some of the pieces of the building, it just seems like it may be a legitimate accident.
Okay, all right. Well, I did also see some articles, and I don't know the veracity of them, fake news and all, that churches had been attacked frequently in the recent years in France.
Is there any group claiming anything? Like, don't usually, if it's some sort of political terrorism, wouldn't they claim responsibility?
Yeah, and I haven't heard anything like that.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about that either.
And there were some mosques too that I think, from what I understand, have been damaged. So it seems to be that that it's a wide variety of faiths and churches that are I don't know, catching on fire or by accident or by a random thing, but it's not connected from what I can tell.
Okay, all right. Well, related to the scaffolding and the work being done, I guess I heard that they had removed much of the artwork for the renovation. And so fortunately, not only did nobody die, but also a lot of these old artworks were not lost. Granted, the ceiling and the joists and all that were like 13th century wood. That's all gone. But it sounds like it's not as bad as it would have been had it been, fully stocked of, all the things that are normally in there.
Yeah, it looks like the stained glass is still intact as well, which I mean, that is some pretty incredible stained glass windows in that church. I don't know if you've seen any, up close pictures of that, but yeah, I was surprised to see that it appears that even the stained glass is fine.
Okay, well, yeah, that is good. I've heard it's a very beautiful building. I've never been myself, but people do mention that it's a very highly visited place, and anyone who goes to Paris pretty much goes and checks it out. That and the Eiffel Tower.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I'm sure it's responsible for all kinds of tourism dollars going into Paris for sure.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to make mention of that. Well, it's a hot topic. That's a bad pun. Sorry. Anyway, we should maybe move into some of the Kathleen Turner Overdrive, which is our Patreon bonus content. So people who want access to that, who are listeners, go to actualanarchy.com/Patreon, and you'll get pre-show and post-show, some early access content, and potentially some new bonuses that Robert and I are cooking up. We might do some live streams of us drinking beers and just ask us anything, shoot the shit kind of thing, which I think would be a lot of fun. So look out for that in the near future. Stephen, thanks again for joining us for this episode on the Passion of the Christ. People can find your work over at AnarchoChristian.com, also the Facebooks and the Twitters and all of that. And I do want to mention that you are also on the Liberty Weekly show last year, talking with Pat McFarland. So I'll put that on our show notes page because we always like to throw a little love his way as well. But any final words for our audience, Stephen, and then Robert, and then we'll get into Kathleen Turner Overdrive.
No, I appreciate you guys having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, come on back next week for Galaxy Quest, everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Peace.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.